Hi everyone, I'm going to get started in 1 minute. Gracias. Vamos a empezar en un minuto.
This is interpreter number 2. I can't do anything with the camera on my laptop, so you're not going to be able to have me interpret. It doesn't give me any options.
Okay, thanks. Let me check in with you. Let's get on that. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Welcome everyone. I'm going to pass it to our interpreter, Florencia, to take us through how to use the interpretation feature, because at GGJ we're committed to language justice and believe everyone should be able to participate in the language they feel most comfortable. So I'm going to pass it to Florencia.
Hi, everyone. Hola todos. So for those who need to access interpretation or who would like to listen to this in Spanish, para aquellos que deseen escuchar este webinario en español, si están accediendo a este webinario a través de una computadora, deberían ver un símbolo del globo terráqueo en la barra de abajo y tienen que ir y hacer clic ahí y seleccionar el canal que deseen. So if you're accessing this through a computer, there should be a symbol of a globe in the bottom bar, and then you click on it and you select the channel that you want. Si están accediendo a través de un celular, tienen que hacer clic donde hay 3 puntitos, donde dice más, y ahí seleccionar el canal y después marcar Done o finalizar. Y ahí deberían poder escuchar directamente, y también tienen la opción, como muestra la pantalla, de silenciar el audio original. If you're accessing through your phone, then you click where it says more and 3 dots, and then you select the channel, then you click done, and you also have the option of muting the original audio. That's it. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Florencia. And again, welcome to the Feminist Economy for People and the Planet teach-in. We'll also have ASL interpretation that will be beginning soon. I think we're in the process of making sure that that gets set up. And yeah, I just wanted to start off by saying that, this is being hosted by the United Frontline Table and the Feminist Green New Deal. And we're really excited to have this conversation with you all tonight. The project of building a feminist economy is a long-term political project. And we think it's one that's absolutely essential if we're trying to build an economy that's prioritizing people and the planet. It's prioritizing life. So as a really brief background, the term feminist economy is coming out of academia. And it wasn't until the early 2000s, when free trade agreements were really wreaking havoc internationally, that grassroots feminists around the world took up the question of what an alternative to our global capitalist system could be. Some of the alternatives they were seeing in front of them weren't actually really grappling with the question of gender. And so this is something we've been explicitly grappling with over the last 30 years, or over the last 20 years. And now we're in the process of defining feminist economy and building an alternative from the grassroots. And within that, there are a number of political tendencies, folks coming from different political perspectives. And we're only going to be representing a few of those here tonight, and grounding them in work that's happening in Hawaii, in Florida, and internationally. And we're hoping that in this process, we can continue this conversation, sharpening each other's analysis around, what a feminist economy is and how we can bring it into our work. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Adrian to tell us a little bit more about the folks hosting this event tonight.
Thank you, Margaret, and welcome everybody. Please introduce yourselves in the chat. Good to see so many people here. You can introduce yourselves with your name, your pronouns, where you are, and any organization that you're repping. My name is Adrian Salazar. I go by he, him pronouns. I'm calling in from occupied Muncie Lenape territory, also known as New York City. And I'm here to introduce the conveners of this call and set the stage a little bit for the amazing panelists that we're gonna have tonight. If you wanna share some of the fire that you will hear on the call today on your social media, make sure you use the hashtag feminist economy, hashtag feminist economy. We are all here today to talk about feminist economy because we're living in a time of overlapping crises that are driven by extractive capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. And the many groups that are on this call have a vision out of these crises. That vision is a just transition to a fair and healthy economy that includes valuing the labor of women, especially women of color, and respecting bodily autonomy and strengthening the infrastructure of care for people to endure the crises at hand. That is the vision of a feminist economy. This session is being hosted by the United Frontline Table and the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition. The United Frontline Table is made up of 16 alliances and organizations that represent multiple populations from across the country in diverse areas of work. Members organize Indigenous communities, Black and Latinx communities, and many other multiracial groups of working class people around the US. The Feminist Green New Deal Coalition gathers organizations and individuals together at the national level to advocate feminist principles rooted in global, racial, economic, and gender justice to guide our response to the climate crisis that we're facing. We know that feminism demands collective action. And so the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition fights for a feminist future where a regenerative feminist economy works for all. This teach-in that you're all here for tonight, or this afternoon, wherever you are, is the second in a series that aims to outline the bold transformative vision that our communities on the ground are building to move away from the current extractive economy of death toward a regenerative economy of life. Can you get the first slide, please? So today we are talking about what a feminist economy is and its part in a just transition to a regenerative economy. Can we get to the next slide? So this vision is part of, there we go. This vision is part of an orientation developed by the United Frontline Table called the People's Orientation to a Regenerative Economy. The member groups of the United Frontline Table are fighting to make sure that working class people and BIPOC communities define what a just transition to a new economy could be that includes all people. That encompasses all aspects of our society that would need to change to build a healthy world that will endure for generations. The impacts of climate change and so many crises that we're facing right now disproportionately harm Black, brown, and working class communities, as is clear in the aftermath of the storms that have swept through Texas, leaving millions of people out of power and many people across the middle of the country dealing with another man-made disaster. And this is what we have seen again and again with impacts of climate crisis, from hurricanes across the Gulf Coast to wildfires across the West. It is our communities that are impacted first and worst. At the same time, communities on the ground are building the solutions to crisis through mutual aid, food hubs, community-owned renewable energy, and deep political organizing. It is our communities on the front lines of crisis, but we are also at the forefront of solutions. Can we go to the next slide, please? So today's teaching is part of a series on a tool called the People's Orientation to a Regenerative Economy. The People's Orientation was developed through deep, rigorous, collective grassroots work to articulate what a people's economy means to us. It was developed through a bottom-up process over the course of a year. You can go to the next slide. This process produced a full spectrum of policy ideas and solutions that was launched in the form of the People's Orientation last year. It was developed from the grassroots and reflects a vision of a just and equitable transition to the world that we need. The People's Orientation includes 80 ideas, policy ideas and solutions, and 14 planks for a regenerative economy. You can go to the next slide, please. It shows how we can build policy solutions from the bottom up that is informed by and led by the people at the grassroots, the people on the front lines of crisis. And this is a beautiful graphic that's part of the People's Orientation that you can see online. And the People's Orientation, the full spectrum of these ideas and planks is available on unitedfrontlinetable.org/report. And we'll pop that into the chat for folks to see. These planks are grouped into 4 overarching interventions: to protect, repair, invest, and transform. We must protect and repair communities and workers from the historic and present violence and tolls of an extractive economy. We must invest in resilient and sustainable infrastructure and systems that center the rights and expertise of Asian and Pacific Islander, Black, Brown, Latinx, Indigenous, poor, and marginalized people. And we must transform the interdependent relationships that connect our governance systems to people, communities, workers, and the earth. There are 14 planks, as I mentioned, in the full agenda. We won't go over all of them, but some examples include issues that groups have been fighting for, organizations like yours, for years and decades. They include strengthening Indigenous and tribal sovereignty, fighting for justice for Black communities, food sovereignty and land sovereignty, and a just transition for workers and communities, and so much more. Today, we are exploring one of these key pillars, investing in a feminist economy. You'll hear from some amazing speakers, radical, awesome feminist leaders about what it means to build feminist solutions to crisis and how we build a feminist economy that lays the groundwork for a world that works for all people. You can learn more again about the People's Orientation and the full spectrum of ideas at unitedfrontlinetable.org/report. I'll pop that into the chat for everybody. Thank you once again for being here. I'm gonna hand it off to folks who will share more about what a feminist economy means, and we're gonna dive into the conversation. I'm handing it off to Kitsia next, who will share more about a feminist economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. And hi, everyone. I'm waiting to be spotlighted by, my name is Kitsia Esteva. I'm the Grassroots Feminism's National Organizer with the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, GGJ. And my pronouns are they. I'm in Ohlone occupied territory. And yeah, I hope, like me, you're here because, really the majority of us are fed up with capitalism, the way that it has consumed everything and has prioritized profit over the lives of people and the planet, which has become even more evident during these pandemic times. We want to challenge capitalism so that we can build a new tomorrow. And as we consider an alternative economic model that prioritizes people and planet over profit, we must recognize gender as a critical lens. Without an insistence on grassroots feminisms and gender justice, we run the risk of transitioning to another economy that thrives off of the degradation and exploitation of women, LGBTQ, and gender non-conforming people. If we can go into some of the slides, please. So just a little bit about what GGJ has been working on in relationship to defining a feminist economy. First, a feminist economy is a critique to the current economic system, right? Capitalism, and also the study of economy based on investment, productivity, capital, and time invested. It's a way for us to reclaim economy as management of home. The word economy has its roots in the Greek words management and home. Even though we are accustomed to thinking about economy in terms of finance, capital, economy just means management of the resources that sustain our habitat. We can claim the economy from the claws of capitalist exploitation and plundering to one that sustains life. In truth, gender oppressed people have always had a role in managing home. Much of what we do to manage and sustain society goes invisibilized and undervalued. Imagine how we can transform society if we think of the economy as the true management of our home, which is the entire planet. Imagine how we could build a new tomorrow if the role to manage and sustain home and sustain life belongs to all and not just feminized people. And finally, the third part of the feminist definition in the next slide, feminist economy is a political proposal that claims proposals for gender and gender non-conforming people's autonomy and transforms the systems of oppression we live in. It proposes a system that places the sustainability of life at the center and is in dialogue with other proposals to be built by people. So political proposals are being defined everywhere in the world, and in some ways we're approaching a synthesis and dialogue inside of those conversations and those proposals. So there's 4 principles to the feminist economy that we describe at GGJ. The first one in the next slide is socializing reproductive labor. Capitalism profits from the gender division of labor and the devaluation of women's work. It relies on the gender binary to reinforce the free and invisible source of labor. Reproductive labor encompasses all the work we do to create and sustain human life, from giving birth, parenting, and raising children to providing food, shelter, clothing, and care for people who rely on us to meet their physical and emotional needs. Reproductive labor encompasses building and maintaining family and intimate relationships, broader communal ties, crisis planning and management, and passing on cultural and knowledge and wisdom. Though this work implicates all of us of all genders, and some aspects of this work have been commercialized by capitalism, the majority of it remains invisibilized, unpaid, and expected from bodies understood as women. So socializing reproductive labor would require that we understand it as a pivotal aspect of sustaining society, that we recognize it as a collective rather than a private matter, and that we transform society so to have adequate infrastructure to compensate reproductive labor and sustain life. It would mean everyone having access to childcare, elder care, and healthcare. It would mean that people who are family caretakers would be compensated for that care. It would mean that male bodies would carry their own weight on household labor as well. We know right now during this pandemic, women and femmes people work has tripled as we try to make ends meet and as we deal with the increase in labor because we're at home. Next slide, please. So bodily autonomy and self-determination for women, feminized, transgender, and gender non-conforming people. Capitalism mixes its DNA with patriarchy and alienates us from our bodies. The word alienate means to transfer control or ownership to another person and to become separate from self. We can practice bodily autonomy and agency by reclaiming our bodies and labor from destructive frameworks that say our bodies are only relevant to serve others and to serve capitalism. Developing a society where we have bodily autonomy and self-determination would include creating the infrastructure that gives people access to free abortion, contraceptives, and pregnancy care. It would also mean access to gender care, like access to hormones and body transitions for trans and gender non-conforming people. It would mean our bodies are ours, self-governed and cherished in the right relationship with each other. It would mean removing people from cages. It would mean that no mother gives birth shackled in a cell, and that we are rethinking the system of child welfare away from being an extension of the racialized carceral system to one that ensures parenting rights and the rights of children. It would mean undoing the culture of rape and violence against women and trans people that have costed lives all over the world, where capital has staked a claim to our bodies, and that they should exist in the world in order to exploit us. Culturally, this also manifests in the socialization of men and masculine people to think of themselves as having ownership over femme people. Next slide, please. Being in the right relationship with nature and Mother Earth. A feminist economy is in conversation with frames like the just transition and indigenous cosmology, buen vivir, or global well-being. Building a feminist economic alternative means moving away from extractive capitalism that sees no boundaries and doesn't respect the boundaries of indigenous people's autonomy, nor the autonomy and rights of Mother Nature. Indigenous and migrant women all over the world are waging struggle to protect Mother Earth. We see this with indigenous women from Copín in Honduras, the political home of Berta Cáceres, protecting the Hualcarque River, to the Indian peasant women movement rising up right now, to the women resisting patriarchy and toxic war in Georgiava, to the women that fought at Standing Rock to oppose the Dakota Access Pipeline. So women and grassroots feminists and gender non-conforming people have real solutions to protect Mother Earth and to stop climate catastrophe. Being in right relationship with Mother Earth and investing in a regenerative economy is a key question for the rights of women and gender non-conforming people. But it's also a key struggle we must win for our survival as a species, really. So imagine what investing in a regenerative economy grounded in respect for life and gender and racial justice would do to curb the climate crisis and for economic recovery in frontline communities. Can we go to the next slide, please? Final principle, being in right relationship with people globally. The US plays a key role in sustaining neoliberalism, capital extractivism, and wars all over the world. What's more, the US sustains war in order to sustain extractive interests for fossil fuels like we see in the Middle East, while also exporting and exacerbating gender violence through war and military occupation. The US imposes austerity in countries it sees as a threat to its capacity to extract or invade. And many diaspora migrant communities, like myself and my family, are forced to migrate to the US because the US has forced environmental degradation, austerity, or war in our homelands. We must develop a feminist economy that prioritizes the right relationship with people in the planet, and inside the political and economic autonomy of Indigenous people, women, and gender non-conforming people. This means completely divesting from the war industry, removing military bases and surveillance programs against social movements all over the world. It means developing an approach to foreign economic cooperation that is based on justice and reparation for the harms the US corporate powers and military has caused people in the planet. It means creating a radical path to democratizing foreign policy so that diaspora communities and people all over the world have a chance at US accountability and a chance to transform relationships with other countries to cooperating to sustain racial and gender justice and really to sustain our planet. So we have a role to play inside of the US to see that our relationship to the rest of the planet is reparative and grounded in justice. So a feminist economy requires undoing centuries of extractive economic policy founded in the ideology of individualization, isolation, and invisibilization of reproductive labor required to sustain life from one day to another. From the care work that happens in the home, to the support that happens in communities, to the resource generation that happens in the planet. Rather than commodify war, the feminist economy engenders peace. And with that, I'll pass it over to Margaret for the next section.
Thanks, Kitsia. Awesome. Okay. So what you're probably now asking is like, that sounds great. And how do we get there? How do we implement this? So as Adrian was talking about in the beginning, frontline communities came together to create the people's orientation to a regenerative feminist economy as the proposal for how we could move this. So if we could go to the slide on the feminist economy link, please. So the people's our current extractive economy to a regenerative feminist one in a variety of areas, including justice for Black communities and transportation and in other realms. We're specifically talking about the feminist economy tonight. And if you could go to the next slide. And if you could click through. So there are, within the people's orientation, again, what Adrian was saying is that it's divided up under, protect, repair, invest, and transform. And we're thinking about how do we implement the vision that we want to see in these categories. So as you can see here, protect women and girls from violence in extractive industries is one of the very first points. And I think IEN and Candy's work in particular really contributed to this being a part of the plank. And I think we'll hear a bit from Simone about how extractive industry has led to the creation of man camps that often are causing harm to women and girls in the surrounding areas. And that this is yet another reason why our current extractive economy is not just harmful to our planet, but is also harming disproportionately women and girls. Then strengthening worker rights and protections. As in this moment, I think it's becoming clear to everyone, as it's been clear to so many of us who are engaged in care work and domestic work, that it is imperative in this moment that we are protecting our essential workers, and that folks have the right to organize and the protections that they need to engage in that safely. Then ending US sanctions. So, as US sanctions have been used as a weapon of resource control around survival needs, and often force governments to rely on extractive industries. And this is something that we believe needs to change if we want to move toward a feminist economy. So lifting US sanctions, paying our climate debt. So the US disproportionately creates pollution in this world, and if we're trying to move in a new direction, it's imperative that we pay for a just transition, not just in our borders, but internationally. Investing in a care economy. This, similar to along the lines of the essential workers, again, green jobs aren't just the jobs that are going to be transitioning, us from extractive economy into green energy. Green jobs are also care jobs, because these are low carbon jobs. These are, this is a way of being that's going to be so essential in a new economy, that we're absolutely clear that folks taking care of each other, taking care of our families is a critical part of the new economy we want to see. And then finally, transforming healthcare and reproductive justice. So all of these elements are in the feminist economy plank of the People's Orientation. And there are specific policy suggestions around how we can move these. And so this is a tool. The People's Orientation is intended to be a tool for really thinking through the ways in which we can transform ourselves and transform our economy in this next period. So with that, I want to move into the panel of folks who are engaging in some of these struggles right now. They are the folks working on the ground to implement parts of the feminist economy in their work. And to do so, I'm going to introduce Bhumika Muchala, who will be moderating the panel, and will give folks on the panel a moment to introduce themselves as well. So Bhumika Muchala is an activist, advocate, writer, and political educator on decolonial and feminist economics and global economic and social justice. She has 20 years of experience in a wide range of global justice organizations, and is currently a senior policy advocate at the Third World Network, a global South network that organizes for justice, rights, and equity in global trade, climate, and economic policies. In the Feminist Green New Deal coalition, she contributes internationalist and decolonial analysis to climate, gender, and economic justice. She'll now be facilitating this panel, and we're really excited to have you, Bhumika.
Hi, everyone. I am so thrilled to be here. This is an amazing panel. We have feminist activists from all different sectors and doing amazing things from the state level to the national level and making intersections with the global level. So this is going to be amazing. So let me first introduce our 4 speakers. They are a really amazing dynamo. So the first speaker I will introduce is Jazmín Delgado. She is the program coordinator for the Center for Political Education, which is a resource for political organizations on the left, progressive social movements, the working class, and people of color. They have led anti-deportation efforts as part of their involvement in the migrant justice movement, and currently serve on the Strategic Advisory Board for the Feminist Peace Initiative, a movement-driven project led by Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, Madre, and Women Cross DMZ. The second speaker I'd love to introduce is Khara Jabola-Carolus. She is the director of the Hawaiʻi State Commission on the Status of Women, a state-level feminist government agency in Hawaii. She's a lawyer and a mother of 2 toddlers. The third speaker, Santra Dennis, is a South Florida native and an anti-racist community advocate committed to centering BIPOC community leadership and racial justice in our progressive movements. Santra has been very active in her community, founding and leading Avance Ansanam, an organization that engages, connects, and builds power among Haitian American millennials, and co-hosts a radio Facebook live show, the VSS Hour. Santra is a New Leaders Council Fellow and a Santla Fellow. Santra graduated from the University of Florida with a bachelor's in health science and from Florida International University with a Master of Public Health and Policy and Management. The last speaker I have the honor of introducing is Simone Senogeles. She is Anishinaabe from the Red Lake Nation in northern Minnesota. She's a member of the leadership team at the Indigenous Environmental Network, where she has worked for the last 20 years. Her programmatic work is focused on Indigenous women's leadership and the importance of lifting up their work and power. IEN is an Indigenous-led and operated environmental justice organization working with Indigenous communities and nations across the US and Canada. They work on climate justice, sustainable communities, and a just transition from a fossil fuel economy to a sustainable and decolonial one. I would now like to begin a round of questions for our speakers. The first question that we will be asking all four speakers is, it's a general question, what is your work? And how do the principles laid out by Kitsia and by Margaret for a feminist economy guide it? You have 2 minutes to answer this first question. I will hand it over first to Khara, and following Khara, Jazmín, and following Jazmín, Santra, and then Simone.
Aloha, everyone. Thank you so much, Bhumika, for the introduction. I am a former immigrant rights organizer in Hawaii, and I'm also a co-founder of Affirm Hawaiʻi, which is an all-volunteer, anti-imperialist, feminist, and revolutionary socialist organization with chapters across nations occupied by the US. So I wanted to give Affirm a shout out. But on a personal level too, which is what really informs my work, is I'm a mestiza from an immigrant family from the Philippines. So I've had to mediate conflicting worlds all my life. And now I find myself in government doing, putting that to practice at a different level and in a different way. And we were, so I run a statewide feminist government agency in Hawaii, and we were the first government agency, I hope there are many others by now, who put out a feminist, explicitly feminist economic recovery from COVID-19. And we did this because we believe that a new economy will not take hold without a new value system and an explicitly anti-patriarchal value system. For us, climate change and women's oppression share the same roots. They are both cultural problems rooted in the value system of patriarchy, which is a social system that is really based on master-servant relationships between men and women and femmes and gender non-conforming people, between men and land, and between nation to nation. And it's diffuse. So we often get the question like, why, I didn't even know there could be a feminist government agency, and why is that so important? So I guess with the 60 seconds left that I probably have, I'll speak to that. You know, government nurses and protects these roots, this value system that is obsessed with control. And it is the dominant ideology across government. So to us, having the space to redistribute power and to push back against that dominant ideology has been so critical to rolling out this plan. And some of the slides illustrate our work. I think there's just 3 in Hawaii, which is really rooted in the fight for land back and bodies back. So for us, our economy is dependent on patriarchal institutions, namely war, and land exploitation, and also its twin systems, the sex trade and other harmful industries. So we wanted to focus on a transition from this and from non-carceral abolition of these systems. And you see here, one of our communities declared a femicide-free zone during the pandemic to build up community understandings of violence and community-based solutions. And then the last slide speaks to the system of militarization here that defines our culture and really incubates this value system around manhood that we focus on. So with that, I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other speakers, so thank you.
Wow, thank you, Khara. Jazmín.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm honored to be here, and I come to you as a Mexican migrant living in the unceded lands of the Chochenyo Ohlone people in what is known as Oakland, California. I'm here representing the Feminist Peace Initiative as a strategic advisor to it. And this is a joint project, just a second. Lost my notes. Okay, so this is a joint project between 3 organizations: GGJ Alliance, which is one of the hosts for today's teaching, Madre, an international women's human rights organization, and Women Cross DMZ, a global movement of women working towards the end of the US-led war on Korea. And if you could just help me with the slide, that would be great. Thank you. So early last year, these 3 groups convened 23 feminist strategists, organizers, and researchers across different sectors to talk about what it would take for our social movements to collectively play a role in reshaping US foreign policy in a way that is aligned with the feminist principles of international solidarity, collective care, and rightful relations with the people of the world and the planet. And so that's right, you know, we were not afraid to think big. It's a tall order, but it's a necessary one. Many of us convened come from communities that have directly experienced the impacts of war and militarism in its many iterations, whether domestic or international. And we believe that our movements can and should play a key role in demilitarizing US foreign policy, but only if we come together, connect our struggles, and organize to do so. And so we, the convening provided a basis for a document that we call A Vision for a Feminist Peace. And if you could help me with the slide there too. And it's a framework document that does 3 things. It shows how the struggle against militarism around the world is an internationalist feminist issue. It invites all of our movements to engage in the arena of foreign policy so that we can put forth, you know, a capacious vision of collective safety for all of us. So in doing so, this framework treats local and international struggles against militarism as interconnected. And lastly, it provides initial concrete recommendations to guide the work of progressive policy makers. And this framework is just a start. There will be more opportunities for cross-sector exchanges, for political education opportunities, and we hope that you can join us. So please follow the work of the Feminist Peace Initiative at www.feministpeaceinitiative.org. Download the framework, read it with your community group or organization, and consider endorsing it. And also want to encourage you to follow the work of my home organization, the Center for Political Education, as a vital resource for analysis, cross-sector dialogue, and thinking around these issues. And to answer just the second part of your question very briefly, I'll say that foreign policy and economic policy always go hand in hand. So a foreign policy that's premised on domination and control upholds the current economic status quo, right? Of concentrating power in the hands of a few, and in quelling attempts by Black, Indigenous, and people of color to protect our communities and to protect our planet. So we want to build a feminist economy that lifts up bodily autonomy, self-determination, socializes reproductive labor, and realigns us in rightful relationships. Then we need foreign and domestic policies that can help safeguard those practices, not through policing, not through criminalization, surveillance, or militarism, but through international solidarity, collective care, a reparative and accountable approach to harm and rightful relations with the planet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jazmín. I have a small note to speak a little bit more slowly to help out our amazing ASL interpreter. So if everyone would speak just a bit more slowly, that would be fantastic. I'm going to hand it over next to Santra. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much for having me. My name is Santra Dennis. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm with Miami Workers Center. And we're located in the Sunshine State in Miami-Dade County, the bottom of the state. And truly to really depict the work of Miami Workers Center, we work with low-wage workers, particularly care workers, your healthcare workers, your house cleaners, your nannies, and we also work with tenants. And so we organize tenants and workers around worker rights, around tenant rights right now. And you can only imagine what folks are experiencing at that intersection right now during this pandemic. We also know that when we're organizing these folks, the most impacted of them are Black and Brown women and femme. And so when you look at the evictions list, we're super thankful for the leadership of our county mayor who has an eviction moratorium in place. But when we look at the list that have been filed in our county, single mothers are the most at risk of evictions right now. We also know that the low-wage workers that really live are the largest population in Miami-Dade County in terms of workers. They're the ones who've really had disruption in their wages. And so this is a huge issue and really speaks to the work of Miami Workers Center, really working and building with those who are the most impacted. We work with Black and Brown immigrant folks, mixed status. We work in, we're very local, and so really trying to make sure that the local campaigns are centered, and also how does a local campaign really connect to the state and the county and the country, the work that we're doing nationally as well. Other things that I'll say right now in terms of what we're centering, in terms of the work that Miami Workers Center is doing, is that we know that the workers, all workers are essential, right? And that the folks who are often left out are folks who are making sure that we who have the privilege of working from home, have the privilege of social distancing. They are the ones who don't have those privileges. And those are the ones who are allowing for us to do the work that we're doing. And so we're building and working with them right now. And I'm excited for this panel, and I'll pause here.
That was amazing. Loved the specific spotlight. Thank you, Santra. Simone?
Hello. Good evening. My name is Simone Senogeles, and I work at the Indigenous Environmental Network. And I want to first thank the organizers for putting this together. I'm actually so excited for this topic that I'm not even nervous about talking about it, because it's just such rich, it's just got the potential to really change the world for all of us. I also want to thank the interpreters. We do a lot of webinars, and some of the interpreters who are working today work with us. And so I'm going to intentionally speak at a slower pace to show my respect and love for y'all. So the Indigenous Environmental Network is an environmental justice organization. You can slip to the next slide if you want. And so we work with Indigenous people in the Americas, mostly here in the US. I am from northern Minnesota. I'm Anishinaabe Kwe, Anishinaabe woman on my mother's side. And on my father's side, I'm Italian from Argentina. And the slide you see in front of us is some of our core work around Indigenous women and the connection between land and body. So some people have probably heard of MMIW, which is Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. And sometimes we add girls, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, relatives. And what we're recognizing is the connection between sort of a colonized land and a colonized body. So violence on the land, violence on the body. And when we take care of the land, we take care of the body. And I'll speak more about that later. Next slide, please. We do work to recognize existing solidarity between Indigenous women of the North and the South. So the picture you see here is a delegation to Guatemala. And then we do webinars to help to inform the public about our idea of Indigenous feminisms. Next slide. And then lastly, we work on extractive industries and particularly pipelines, climate justice, environmental justice. So this slide is about line 3, a pipeline that is going through my community. And we recognize that, you know, under colonization, Mother Earth has been extracted from the same way that our bodies have been extracted from. So they trespass our lands like they trespass our bodies. Our bodies are stolen, sold, and exploited in much the same way that our Mother Earth is, and our other non-human relatives, our water, our land, our animals, our relatives. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you, Simone. Thank you, all the speakers, for that wonderful first round. We are going to move into now a sort of roundtable where I am going to ask each of you specific questions. And leading up to this, I just want to also zoom out and tie in all the amazing threads that each of you have highlighted, from the patriarchy that shapes policymaking to the intersections of foreign policy and the ties between military and economic policies globally, to the highlighting and upholding of the specific human beings, the specific women and communities that are being most impacted right now, that are really upholding all of us. And to note that in this time of pandemic, we see that the care economy and the work of caring and the laboring for the communities is really what's upholding all of us. So in terms of really looking at who matters, where is value being generated, who is really subsidizing whom in the economy, we see that the care economy is front and center. So now to move into the sort of roundtable of questions, I'm going to start with Santra. And the question to you specifically is, can you tell us about how your local work is relating to the development of national feminist economic interventions like we are seeing in the Thrive agenda? You have about 4 to 5 minutes.
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. Lots of things to discuss. And so the Thrive agenda really speaks to housing, right? Making sure that there are labor protections and worker protections for folks who are working, specifically care workers doing that dignified work of taking care of our elderly, our children, and the sick when they most need it, right? We also talk about a little the connection between, at least for us in the local work, housing and climate. And I'm going to actually take them one by one in terms of the work that we're doing on the ground and why we think it's important. One thing I'll name right now is all work is essential, right? And so right now what we're seeing is that there's this wanting to these folks are to compare folks, who's essential and who's not. And we know that all workers are essential. And some of the folks who are being left out are folks who actually, where would we be without them right now, right? And so the ability for some of us to go back to work is because we have care workers who are making that possible for us, right? And so I want to make sure that I name that And also that those are the same folks who are most vulnerable at this point, right? They're going into people's homes. They don't necessarily know what their status is in terms of whether or not they've had COVID scares. And so many of the protections that they need even right now don't exist. And so I think it's really, let's not divide and conquer here. Let's make sure that all folks are included as we talk about workers and who's essential and who really deserves worker protections. And worker protections, you know, as we see it at Miami Worker Center, really speaks, so I'm trying to slow down, sorry. Worker protections really include childcare, which is a huge issue right now that's really front and center, paid sick time off, wages that are adequate, you know, all the things, right? All the things that I know. I say paid time off, and I also say, what does retirement look like for workers, right? Can folks who do care work, do they have a pathway to retirement? And so all encompassing in terms of the work that we do at Miami Worker Center, really building, working with our domestic workers who happen to be, we have a Latinx group, and we also have half Afro-Caribbean who predominantly are Haitian, and many of them have mixed status. So of course, we're thinking about immigration, why folks migrate. All of those things are really important for us. I think right now, as it relates to housing, and the eviction defense work that we're doing right now is really critical as well and top of line. We know that there's this theory around folks' ability to social distance right now. And we know that for many of our folks, they live in complexes, they live in homes where there are a lot of people living together. And it also, you know, prevents them from really social distancing. We also know that many of the folks, like I mentioned earlier, the folks who have evictions in the courthouse right now for them, many of them, majority of them are single mothers. And so we know these are folks who, one, are still trying to figure out their childcare, work in jobs where they don't have benefits, won't be able to make up any of this. And so this is really the challenge, and we really want to lift up the real narrative of what's happening on the ground, and dismiss the narrative around their squatters who don't want to pay their rent. But really, these are actually workers who are trying to go back to work or working right now, and they too need protections. The other thing I'll add is we just got an alert actually yesterday, around 100 days before hurricane season. And so it's like, so much that folks have to think about. And I think that for us, it's really around the displacement that we see in the urban core in Miami-Dade County that has the highest elevation, that's not on the beach, and people really wanting to push our communities out because the beach is flooding. And so there's been tons of work that Miami Worker Center have done in terms of holding the line, in terms of anti-displacement, to make sure that, one, people can stay in their homes, and also that if they do decide to move, that there is affordable housing that they can move into that will not flood, that will not be impacted by the extreme weather that we get in Miami-Dade County. Also want to kind of say that for me, what the crisis for us is that as we think about this pandemic as well, you know, we're dying. The communities that we work with, the communities that we represent, we're the ones that die. We're the ones who are unemployed right now. I mean, we're the ones who can't social distance. And so what does it look like for us to really hold space and to center these folks because they need it the most, and not to make compromises, and to really ensure that when we are saying we're fighting for workers and worker protections, we're talking about all of our folks, because we know that if we leave some of those folks out, that we're talking about death, we're talking about displacement, we're talking about an inability to actually really catch up after such a huge loss. And not only this year, but this is like decades. You all know this more than I do, of policies that don't necessarily allow for them a pathway to thrive in our country. So much that Miami Worker Center is really thinking about and pushing our local elected officials, but also at the state. The state of Florida is, I'm born and raised, but it's complicated here. But for sure, we believe that there is power in the people, and we're organizing people to truly understand that they, you know, they have power and they have leadership, and that folks work for them, and that this country needs to ensure that they have the rights and things that they need to thrive. So all this to say, housing, workers, also making sure that the folks who are the most impacted, we're talking about Black and brown women, folks who are immigrants, that we're center their experience and we're building with them. And I'll pause there. I think I'm almost out of my 4 minutes. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Santra. That was amazing. You know, we really can see the interconnectedness of all the strands of legislation. You tied in immigrant rights, housing rights, public services, minimum wage increases, and the need for our feminist lens through all of these policies. It really highlights the importance of just legislation. Next, I want to move on to Khara and invite you to talk about something specific. So the Hawaii Feminist Economic Recovery Plan for COVID-19 gained national attention because it spoke to both this moment and the longer term solutions we need to build. So Khara, as a person inside a government institution on the state level, what are you learning from working to roll out the Feminist Economy Recovery Plan? How can we keep building on the openings that exist right now to push for economic transformation, to redefine the government's priorities from extractive corporate priorities to those grounded in feminist and intersectional racial justice? Over to you, Khara.
Thank you. Well, as much as we're seeing around the world, governments leverage this crisis to justify eroding democratic processes and transparency and accountability to the community, we were really conscious about trying to counteract that trend. And so with us, it was all about this moment and seizing on the radicalization that's organically happening in our communities. So what we found is really that right now, this idea that the economy is a given has really taken a hit. In Hawaii, I think there's a better understanding, especially among the women in the community who we work with, that the economy is an expression of a very specific and harmful set of values that came about through a historical process that we and the community were intent on undoing in this moment and seizing the moment to do that. We are a colony in the Pacific Ocean, recently colonized by the United States. And so on one hand, there is this very fresh collective memory of potent women deities, potent women leaders who were very much committed to stewardship of land and people and a mutuality in that relationship. And so on one hand, we have that framing this moment. And on the other hand, we are surrounded by cultural imagery of imperialism's icons. Our schools, our streets, our awards, our airport are named after men like William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, and more recently, Daniel K. Inouye. And they represent really the core values of the American nation and the American economy. And that is, right, like manhood, an obsessive amount of control, domination, virility, and independence over interconnectivity and interdependence. And then when I say control, I mean, right, never having control by somebody else and never being accountable, and always feeling entitled to access. So for us, we had an awareness of this, at least our community of women activists here. And we also had this awareness, ironically, Teddy Roosevelt believed in absolute women's equality with men. He said no woman should adopt a man's last name even. He was essentially a liberal feminist. And you know, this individualism that has really dominated our space here in women's advocacy and environmental advocacy, climate justice, the progressive spaces, this idea that we can and should strive to achieve the same privileges as white American men, ignores patriarchy and also can coexist with patriarchy. So we found that there was an appetite to reclaim feminism and to use the term feminism, because that's the question I get, like, why did you use the term feminism? And that was incredibly conscious. Because without that word, the default, the factory setting of society and our economy is patriarchy. And so we had to be very specific and name the structures that we wanted to abolish. And so for us, really, again, as I said at the beginning, it's about land back and bodies back together, and not in competition with each other. And when we say land back, we mean that Native people have the right to remove all patriarchal institutions from Native land. And that for us can be the colonial gender binary, war, the sex industry, the short-term vacation rental industry, these systems of harm in a non-carceral just transition. And colonization led to theft of our land, our homes, but not just land, also our first homes, our bodies. And so body sovereignty is front and center as part of our plan. And this includes valuing life from the beginning. So, manifesting as universal childcare, finally the construction of a maternal care system, which is non-existent in Hawaiʻi. And also the universal guaranteed right to exit harmful systems. This is really important for us, whether we're talking about intimate institutions like marriage and relationships, or industrial relations that create this gender binary and subservient role for women, like the sex industry in Hawaiʻi. Our bodies being ours means not belonging to the carceral state, not belonging to the ruling class of men, and not belonging to the free market. All, not just one or two of those, were important to our plan. And to answer the last part, in terms of building, it was really important for us to kind of check ourselves and de-academize feminism, make it accessible, and show our community the ways that their lives can improve concretely from new values rooted in feminism. So thank you.
Thank you, Khara. There was so much coming out of what you said. I want to pull out a few threads, a few strands. You invoked potent woman deities and woman leaders, and I think that's so key to really, redefining what is feminist knowledge, and that feminist knowledge comes from embodied knowledge. It is not the hierarchy of knowledge systems in the academy and in formal ways of learning. Feminists know their knowledge in their bodies. They live their knowledge, and I think that is really key. You brought out maternal and childcare policies, and that is so important in what has happened in our society with the privatization of the family and privatization of childcare. It is so deeply and fundamentally unnatural to not have villages and communities to raise children, as well as the heteronormativity and the patriarchy written into family structures, which are nowhere as communal as they ought to be in their natural forms. And body sovereignty is something that we will be coming back to repeatedly, especially as reproductive justice is at the center of a feminist economy and a feminist world vision. So I want to now turn to Simone. My question for you, Simone, is how is the Indigenous Environmental Network bringing a feminist structural lens to the fight against extractive industries and for Indigenous sovereignty, and the role, the powerful leadership of women and girls in Indigenous sovereignty making? Over to you, Simone.
Thank you. So I think when we are talking about a feminist economy, what we're really talking about is, and when we think about a feminist economy compared to our current economy that we're in, we're talking about nothing short of a different worldview, right? So when we talk about economy in terms of the way that it's been defined by GGJ and others, which includes right relationship with people, right relationship with land and Mother Earth, reproductive justice, all of those tenets, right? They reflect a worldview upon which many societies, especially those that are represented here today. So those societies embody a different worldview that necessitates an economy of care rather than an economy of profit, right? So what we're talking about in some ways is new because it's decolonizing work. We're climbing out of this colonization, of militarization, of patriarchy, of white supremacy. And yet the roots of a feminist economy are built into our DNA as people, as Indigenous people and others. It's familiar to us, right? So an economy where everyone is taken care of and everyone is cared for, it's intuitively correct for us, rather than this alienation that we feel when we're in opposition to each other and when there's so much competition. And in order for someone to thrive, someone else has to suffer. And so when I think about Indigenous, or when I think about feminist economy, it's very much in keeping with the worldview upon which our work is already based. So I want to lift that up as far as Indigenous worldview. So as far as man camps and extractive industry, we recognize that the extractive industry and the capitalism upon which this country is based affects Mother Earth in much the same way it affects our bodies. And so when we see things like pipelines, I'll use the Line 3 pipeline, which is carrying dirty tar sands through our water-rich homelands of Anishinaabe and Dakota people here in Minnesota. We recognize that that extractive industry is also violence on our bodies, and it plays out in many ways. One is that we are very connected to water as Anishinaabe women, and we recognize water as the portal from which someone moves from the spiritual into the physical world. And it's our responsibility to take care of water. And I'd like to lift up that concept when we're talking about worldviews of responsibility rather than rights. And that's central to much of Indigenous thinking. We have responsibility more than we have rights. And so man camps are when a bunch of out-of-state workers, men, there's an influx of men who come into our communities to engage in this extractive industry that's so harmful to Mother Earth and also so harmful to our women, LGBTQ, and our children. Sex trafficking rates rise because these men come in, they have no accountability to our community. Their grandmas don't live here, you know, they don't care. We can't tell on them. We can't hold them accountable. And they have extraordinary amounts of money, and they feel very entitled. I'm so sorry. They feel very entitled to our bodies, our lands, and Mother Earth. So we have sex trafficking already happening. You know, my phone never rings except for when I'm on. Can you guys hear that? I hope you can. I'm so sorry. Ruined my flow. How much time do I have? So there's so much to talk to, and I resonate with what everyone has been saying, and I think there's so much interconnectivity about topics that we're speaking about. And so the last thing I want to say about the worldview and this economy of life rather than economy of profit is that a worldview like ours and like many of the people on this panel that recognizes water, for example, as a sentient, living relative rather than a commodified thing to be bought and sold on the market. It informs a different relationship that is so much more sustainable for all life. And the same thing with our bodies as women. They have been commodified to be stolen, to be bought and sold, to be exploited, to be thrown away. And so the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, there's so many of us who go missing. We are murdered, we are kidnapped, we are assaulted, and it goes largely unnoticed. And part of this is because of the legacy of colonization, and that this country depends upon our oppression. It depends upon women being exploited. It depends upon our sexual exploitation, because we have always held positions of power and influence in our societies. And when colonizing forces want to disempower our societies, they know that they need to target Indigenous women. And this is not just a historical thing, this is my now. It's not my history, it's my now. So I think that, we just have to recognize that we're talking about very different worldviews, and the one that we're working toward, whether we call it a feminist economy, an economy of life, Indigenous economy, all these different economies, what we're really talking about is a shift in worldview that we have to make. And again, I wish that I could talk so much longer, because I have 4 pages of notes of all these wonderful things I want to speak with the panelists and the participants about. I hope this conversation will continue beyond this webinar. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Simone. That was so powerful. And your phone did not stop your magic. It was a tiny footnote. This was so powerful. So many things coming out of these interventions, right? I mean, the coloniality of the ways in which we relate to nature, right? Some of the oldest colonial texts actually said, essentially the message is land is empty, nature is dead. Well, if land is empty, it can be colonized, it can be raised, it can be raped, it can be accumulated and dispossessed. And if nature is dead, it can be extracted, it can be mutated, it can be distorted. And that is essentially the foundations of capitalism. Foundations of extractive capitalism is the dehumanization of nature, and in similar ways to all the oppressed peoples of the earth, from women to workers and people of color and the LGBTQI communities and the trans communities. And so we see these intersections between the marginalization of our human societies and the dehumanization of nature. Water is so key. It goes back millennia. It is the foundation of life. And yet just 2 months ago, California, the state of California, announced that it will start trading futures in water derivatives, or else, making financial instruments out of water. This has been feared for a long time, but this is now unraveling in the time of COVID. So we see so many different directions we need to go in terms of really redefining our relationship to nature, because as the impacts of COVID fall out, we're going to see an ever more aggressive kind of financialization of nature, which is already happening in so many ways. So thank you for that. Over to Jazmín. I want to ask you, Jazmín, why is it critical for our feminist movements to have an internationalist approach? What are the key intersections in really reformulating a right relationship with the world, and to be cognizant of the outsized impact and role of the US empire?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'll definitely be more mindful about speaking more slowly. And, the COVID-19 pandemic in particular, and the events of 2020 have just made it so painfully apparent that the conditions that are causing us so much unsafety, the pandemic, accelerating climate catastrophe, and the neoliberal gutting out of the economic social safety net that our communities need to survive and thrive. These are all global issues. And so it's become painfully aware for many of us that none of us are safe unless all of us are safe. And at the same time that we have, this realization, we also, need to take into account the role that the U.S. has played in creating these conditions of collective unsafety at a global scale. And we can, see these in two instances, both interrelated. One is the role of the U.S. in driving the current climate crisis, and also the role of the U.S. in economic coercing people and nations around the world to fit its political and economic interests, and further causing more unsafety. And so, one of the things that that is a cure, I think, for this collective condition of unsafety is international solidarity against U.S. militarism. We need to keep in mind that the U.S. is the single biggest polluter on the planet. It guzzles fossil fuels to keep its operations and bases, artillery running around the world. And because of that, it's also the largest emitter of greenhouses. And just as the military industrial complex runs on fossil fuels, right, to keep itself running, militarism in turn also drives violent resource extraction, and it plays a key role in quote unquote securing, right, these resources from nations and peoples that it deems as its economic political rivals. And so, since we're in a teaching around the Green New Deal, around creating rightful relations with the planet and other people, we should be clear that militarism is deployed ruthlessly on Indigenous people in the front lines of climate justice struggles, water protectors, land protectors. And a case in point is the brutal repression that the water protectors in Standing Rock faced with the deployment of the National Guard, with police coming out in full force. And this is pretty consistent with what militarized nations do around the world with climate justice organizers and Indigenous water and land protectors in particular. This is not at all separate from the violence that is waged against Black people in their cities, Indigenous people waging struggles for a world that actually lets us all live and thrive. And so it's really important to connect these dots between policing, surveillance, and militarism across the world. And so, we see that as people residing on occupied, land, the Turtle Island, and living under U.S. occupation, we also, as residents of this place, also have a debt, to pay with things that are done in our name across the world and also here at home. Another thing, to address is the question of economic sanctions, which the U.S. uses as a means of exerting pressure on nations and peoples that it sees as antithetical to its political and economic agenda. And sanctions play a key role in devastating the social safety net of everyday people living in countries like Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, Zimbabwe, and many other nations targeted by the US. That means they don't have access to the water, the medical resources, the things that they need to be able to survive. And this is especially deadly in a pandemic. And so, in the words of feminist foreign policy leader, the Feminist Peace Initiative leader, Diana Duarte, sanctions are used to, quote unquote, inflict collective pain in order to generate a political result. And this is simply unacceptable. Sanctions also play a key role in exacerbating climate catastrophe because it forces nations to conduct unsustainable practices of resource extraction, since they have no other way of getting the resources that they need. And this is happening very much in Iran, for example. And so we need to understand that our fates are intertwined, just as the systems that are used to plunder our people, to plunder our lands, to extract resources, to surveil and criminalize us. They run the world. It's the long tentacles that run the world. Capital itself knows no borders. And so our solidarity also needs to transcend all of these borders, be unequivocally anti-colonial and unequivocally internationalist.
Thank you, Jazmín. That was really powerful. So much food for thought there. I want to just highlight a few key threads before we move out to our closing session. Jazmín mentioned international solidarity being so very key in moving forward with building alliances, building coalitions, and being mindful of the realities that people elsewhere face, relative to the enormity of US power. Jazmín mentioned the United States has been the largest carbon emissions polluter since 1829, thought to be the start of industrialization. The United States is responsible for two-thirds of global carbon emissions historically. So when we talk about climate debt and the responsibility and the imperative of the United States government to participate in climate reparations, climate debt. This is a climate justice movement. It's well and thriving, but this needs to be front and center. And in fact, discussions of reparations and repair have to be also really at the core of what a feminist economy is calling for. Militarism and sanctions are intimately tied to the power of US corporations. And while we all know that we are living in a world that is captured by corporations, this is especially true in other countries where national laws and even national governments and sovereignty don't have the power to push back on the enormous power of US corporations. We're seeing that today, where the vast majority of the world cannot access the vaccine due to the intellectual property rights being enforced by US pharmaceutical corporations, and where countries like South Africa and India have been fighting for access to vaccines or to generic production of vaccines through the World Trade Organization. It is the United States that is the principal bully or the principal force blocking access to vaccines by trying to at least temporarily undo intellectual property rights rules, for example. And we also know that the United States drives a lot of privatization through its financing schemes, whether it's through the World Bank or whether it's through aid money. There are the undercurrent of privatization is something that we also have to deeply resist in a world vision of a feminist economy, which is reclaiming public financing for public systems, for public services, and for public goods, and really identifying how these privatization policies, constrain and block access, affordability, and equity to the public domain. So in calling for a feminist economy, we put that front and center. I want to move to the closing and invite Margaret. I missed the most exciting part. We're going to get futuristic for a moment. So I'm going to ask all the panelists to close their eyes. I really mean that. Everyone close your eyes. And each one of you have 30 seconds to tell us, what does your imagination say and bring to you for a feminist economic alternative? You have one sentence, and I will start with Khara, then Jazmín, then Santra, and then Simone. Over to you, Khara.
Well, the first thing that came to my mind was, we talked a lot about right relationships with each other. My one sentence is, Also, a feminist future to me and economy allows us to be in a loving and right relationship with ourselves and our body too.
Jazmín?
A world where we all care for each other, where we see it as our duty to support the thriving of each and every person and our other than human relations and the planet.
Santra?
Yeah, a world where we care for each other, for ourselves and each other, and Mother Nature.
Thank you. And Simone?
Yeah, I envision, I know this is sort of strange, but I envision many of the women I know and all of their individual strifes and struggles, and I imagine them all smiling with confidence and love and, you know, just being joyful and happy and powerful.
Thank you, Simone. That was amazing to hear all of your visions and how they come together in just a natural, intuitive unity as well. So I think Margaret is joining me for the call to action at the conclusion here. So I am going to give a summary conclusion, and Margaret is going to bring announcements and agitation for call to action. So we have heard from 4 brilliant, critical, powerful, and alive activists here who are on the front lines, who are working with communities. It has been absolutely brilliant to listen to all of you and to be inspired, to be mobilized, to be informed of what all of you are doing. It is so clear that a feminist economy is about remaking our world into one of equity, of justice, of liberation, of unity. It is about dismantling the ways in which our society has been unequally organized through socially constructed hierarchies, through all kinds of constructions that create an economy of death. And we need to reverse that fully into an economy for life, where the caring economy, the labor of caring, of birthing, of providing, of growing food, of sustaining is at the front and center, not as the invisible shadow work that is upholding the so-called productive wage economy, but rather at the very nucleus center of what an economy is. An economy has to be sustained on the work of caring and interdependency, and that is what the feminist economy is really highlighting and celebrating. Over to you, Margaret.
Thank you so much, Bhumika, and thank you to our. That was incredible. It's clear that, you know, all of us are visionary, and at the same time, you all are doing the work. So we're pushing for a world that we want to see, and to do that, we're experimenting and we're learning and we're growing. And I realized I did not introduce myself earlier, but my name is Margaret Quatson, and I'm the Green New Deal National or Grassroots Global Justice. And I say this in part because one of the areas where we've been bringing a feminist analysis is in the Green New Deal work, specifically through the first part of a Green New Deal, which is the Thrive Agenda that Santra mentioned. And so as she was saying, the Thrive Agenda is calling for an economic recovery that transitions us away from an extractive economy and invests in a care-centered economy. And this is one of the ways that we're trying to move our vision in this moment. And it's, you know, possible for you all to take action on this as well. So I'm going to a link on how to take action on that in the chat. And then similarly, conversation we're having is clearly one that is currently influencing a lot of national politics. And we think that there's a lot of potential and energy to move what we want to see in a feminist economy forward in this moment. And so one of the other things that's happening is that Jamal Bowman is going to be releasing next Monday a resolution on the care economy and on how that work could be centered and could be expanded and could be protected. And so I'm going to post in the chat the place where you can organizationally sign on to that resolution. And then next Monday, there'll be a launch event for that, where we'll be discussing why, again, it's like so critical in this moment, particularly when we're thinking about recovery and not going back to how it was, but building a new economy, one that centers life, why care work is so central in that. So I want to say thank you again to all of our panelists. And I know that there are some press folks on this call. And so we'll be posting in the chat a link where you can register for the call we're going to go to right as to speak a bit with the panelists and to have Q&A with the press. So once again, live tweeted on the handles of GGJ Alliance and the It Takes Roots. And if you can follow the hashtag Feminist Economy, that's also where folks have been chiming into the conversation. This is just the beginning. I think this will be the first of a number of conversations that we're continuing as we define a feminist economy and then continue to share in the work of implementing it. So thank you again to everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Go